Thank you. I will just say a few words as we're getting the chairs set up here. We are going to be talking about how do you reap the benefits of diversity. So you have a diversity-based enrollment, and then what? I mean, that is not a magic wand. That automatically means there's equity, as Secretary King said. I mean, now the hard work really begins. And so our panelists today are going to unpack that and share some of their successes, some of their challenges, and hopefully we can really get some lessons here, because it's not easy work. We're going to be talking about what happens on the classroom level and making sure that the classrooms are desegregated, what happens in terms of discipline, and the talk after is going to go into that even more. We're going to talk about inclusive family engagement and also the curriculum. How do we make sure that what happens in the classroom respects and values the diversity of the students? So now I'd like to bring up our panelists. We have a very deep bench. So let's do that. So Christy Dragon, she is CEO and co-founder of Citizens of the World Charter Schools. It's a national network, and it started in LA. And prior to Citizens of the World, she served as vice president of regional operations for Teach for America's Western regions. And she served as she was the founding co-chair of the National Advisory Board of the Collective, TFA's National Alumni of Color Association. And then we have Dr. Ghislaine Ngunu. There she is. And she is an education leader and a social justice activist. And she currently holds the role of the Chief Program Officer of PDK International, where she oversees development and implementation of new programs, including school system level partnerships with superintendents. And prior to joining Phi Delta Kappa International, she was the chief of staff for Hartford Public Schools in Connecticut. And so I'm sure she has a lot of experience with their diversity program there. Patricia Perkins, here she is. She's the founding principal of Morris Jeff Community School in New Orleans. You've heard a little bit about this school, and she is an accomplished educator and instructional leader, and she has more than 30 years of experience. So she has a lot to share. She was an elementary school teacher, curriculum coordinator, school leader. She's done it all at all levels and has seen a lot of what choice means for a city. And we have Kate Seidel. Here you go, thank you. And she's the principal of City Neighbors Charter in Baltimore. And City Neighbors is a really unusual model. It combines the Reggio Emilia teaching practices of arts integration and project-based learning. And she's done it all at City Neighbors as well. She served as literary specialist and librarian and has children who graduated from the school. So we're going to get right into it. I'll sit down, I guess. Yeah. And so I want to jump into the nitty-gritty and talk about, let's first talk about classroom practices. There's some research that indicates that a large part of academic achievement gaps come from tracking students, right, from different backgrounds. And so often we'll see that even if schools are diverse, then what happens within the classroom it can be different. And so what we want to hear from you is how can school leaders differentiate without resegregating students? So let's, shall we go down the line? Would you like to start first, Christy?
My name is Christy Dragon. Thank you for having me here today. And I have 5 schools in LA, 2 in New York, and 1 in Kansas City, with the second one opening in 2019. Our schools right now are only kindergarten through 8th grade, so we don't actually have the high school tracking issues that I think others can speak to. But for us, it's all about the management and measurement of data to ensure that performance, which starts with access, is happening on an equal playing field for everyone. So that does affect our course offerings and it affects our expectations. We try to just raise the bar on what's offered in the upper grades when it comes to math and sciences, knowing that those are feeders not just to high school placement, but feeders to lifelong opportunity choices. You actually kind of decide whether someone's going to be a doctor in about 7th or 8th grade by their math placement. And so we take it very seriously. I'd love to open it up for folks who I know have much tougher challenges when it comes to AP and IB placement.
I would say one thing that can be done is addressing adult beliefs to begin with. We track students because that's a perfect example of modern day within school segregation. And one example I have found powerful and inspiring was the work of my boss, George Starr, when he was a superintendent in Stamford, Connecticut, to think about the resistance that you encounter when you want to detract or stop tracking practices. So one step is to raise the floor for everyone and create levels that are rigorous and set students for high expectations, but also provide supports. But also it's important for schools and for districts, right, to create policies that do not allow educators within schools to lower students' levels because they believe kids can't do it and young people can rise to expectations. So one thing he did in Stanford, especially with math subject, was to create 2 levels, one that was college prep and one that was AP and honors, but also along with that, to implement a policy where teachers and principals were not allowed to lower students' levels. And by doing so, he was able to then meet the interest of white parents who were resistant to the idea that high-level courses were going to be opened up for all children in the system. So policies and high expectations and addressing adult beliefs and calling the elephant by its name, right? So we can say that, talk about that more later.
So I'm Patricia Perkins from Morris Jeff Community School in New Orleans. We set out when we wrote our charter to be an IB school all the way through, pre-K4 all the way to 8th grade. Then about 5 years ago, we had parents coming to us saying, aren't you going to expand to high school? So we weighed all of those options and decided to do a high school expansion. And this year we've had our 9th grade class. So when Secretary King was talking about IB programs, for pre-K all the way up to 8th, those are very inclusive, and they are not, kids aren't tracked. The students have to be together, and that's one of the mandates of IB with younger children. However, as the kids get older, we know that the diploma program, which we typically call IB at the high school level in grades 11 and 12, can be very rigorous and are very rigorous offerings. And just like AP, oftentimes we have seen kids not have the opportunity to take those courses. So what we did this year, and we don't have the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but we did create a policy by which we found as many access points as possible for kids who might be coming to our school new, or for kids who even typically, who had been with us, had had difficulty with math, and how we can quickly remediate and accelerate them to make sure that at least by 10th grade, there were continued access points to consider how a student could then get that standard or high-level diploma by 12th grade. So the entry point at our school can be 8th grade, 9th grade, or 10th grade. So if you're a new kid coming from another school, you still have that possibility of accessing that math course by 11th grade, as long as we know that's what you want. That doesn't mean it's a magical formula by any stretch, but we just tried our best to figure out as many points along the way where a student could access.
I'm going to build on that, Patricia. Because at City Neighbors, we have a motto that we use the expression and we wear it on our T-shirts, and it's called known, loved, inspired. So when I wear it, I'm talking to kids and I'm talking to teachers. When the children wear it, they're talking about me. We're all trying to know one another, love one another, and inspire one another to great heights. And what that looks like in two concrete forms might be that the teachers are frequently gathering and talking about children. And we have planned time as a structure for teachers to gather and talk about children, their strengths, their weaknesses, their family situations, what's next for them, and then design. Teachers have time to design programming that suits those particular children and those particular needs. One structure that we have is called intensives. Children from 4th grade to 8th grade have 45 minutes a day where they're placed by thoughtful teachers who have talked about them and known them and loved them into challenging situations for them, whether that challenge might be reading, writing, or we have an intensive happening right now that's psychology. For kids who are really having a hard time figuring out, how do I get my brain to do the things that I want it to do, but it seems to kind of sometimes work against me. And that has been a fascinating adventure that is both social and emotional and academic. It also allows for teachers to know children in small groups. I call it the most expensive time of the day because we have 11 teachers teaching groups of 11 children at a time. And that allows us to truly know, love, and inspire them, as well as to really capture, feel inspired ourselves as teachers about how can we create something that's going to have that floor-to-ceiling model and just keep that floor climbing. So I'm just going to share those two for now.
And to go back now, Ghislaine sort of touched on this about the parents, and I want to delve more deeply into that. I know the question for the previous panel also talked about parent engagement, and a lot of the work that we did writing these case studies, we heard from school leaders that a lot of conflicts do happen between the parents, and I wanted to find out if you have found that true in your practices, and what do you do? How do you build relationships and trust between parents who might come from different backgrounds and have different perspectives? I mean, it's very hard work. So let's start with Kate now. We're going back.
So at City Neighbors, it's not a dictate, it is a tradition or it's a cultural norm for families to give 40 hours of family involvement or engagement per year. And that's about 80% of the families are able to achieve that number. And we keep track of that. One board member, who is also a parent and unelected by the parents, is the family engagement coordinator, whose only job is to account for, hey, when'd you come into school? Do you know that there's another opportunity out there? We try and save a lot of money as a charter school and put all of our funds into teaching and learning, and that means that the building is cared for by parents and me. And that means we have work days, and so we're often scrubbing and painting and doing things right next to each other, and I can't tell you how many awesome conversations happen while you're putting up the blinds with parents and with one another. There's also the opportunity to simply come into the exhibitions of learning. That gets counted. Count everything that parents are doing to come in, and you'll find that conflicts, some of that level of discomfort gets taken away because of our familiarity with one another, or our relationship, being known, loved, and inspired with one another, winds up helping to carry us through, because conflict's going to happen. We're going to be different. We're going to have differences of opinion, and that's actually a sign of a very vibrant community, as long as you can work through them, as long as they don't go to a level of discomfort that leads to tension that isn't established. So there are so many ways, but parent involvement and counting it and hoping for it, anticipating it, inviting it nonstop is if a parent can't come in, how can that parent do something from afar? How to make that feel welcome and truly involved.
And I want to hear a little bit more from you, Patricia, about how do you ensure that some parents' voices don't get lost, and that some, I know that in the panel before, someone was saying the more affluent parents' voices sort of take over.
Right. Right. So when we started this school, I knew that we needed a parent group, right? But I was a little bit worried that the parent group could take the form of, I guess, the worst of a PTA, right? Because we know that those stereotypes exist. And one of the things that the first president of the parent group did was when we were all sitting around the table, that was our first year. We had 200 kids, we had 21 faculty members, we had about 100 parents. And we had a lot of parents early on who were at the school a lot, and that was very important. She sat around the table for the first meeting when we had probably maybe 30 parents there, and she looked around and she said, we are not, this isn't correct here. We don't have this right. We're not representative. It's up to each of us to do our part to reach out to someone that we don't know well, to someone who is different from us. And so the parents started intentionally doing that. Now, there's no magic formula, right? It's about building those relationships, and I know that's like a tried and can be, I don't know, a misunderstood phrase, but if parents are reaching out to each other and reaching out to people they don't know, then that is the way that this community gets stronger, that any community gets stronger. So the first year, we created a lot of different events. There had already been a community gala to support the school, which was wonderful, and a lot of people love galas. Then a parent came to my office one day and said, I'm not a gala person, but I'll start your gift wrap sale, and I'll raise you some money. And then we had another parent who said, I don't like to sell gift wrap, but I love to fry fish. And in the spring in New Orleans, we have fish fries all through Lent. It's every school does it, public, private, everybody does it. And so that was a way that, and we just said, yes, do it. Fry the fish, cook the burgers, do whatever it's going to take for every parent who wanted to be involved to hopefully find their niche. And that continues to be really hard work. We also have a board chair, a board representative who is a parent, who also is the lead of our community engagement committee. And he works very, very hard every year to continue to build out that group, to continue to find new ways to reach out to the community. And I heard someone mention in the early panel about the importance of the kinds of events that you have, and how many of those it takes for everyone to finally feel like, oh, I could go to that one, like especially when kids are performing. I want to be there. In New Orleans, we have this thing called Mardi Gras, right? So we have a Mardi Gras children's parade at our school. You would not believe all the relatives and grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles who come, but that's another event where everyone comes because it's part of the culture and community that's in New Orleans. I could talk more about the intentional work that our parents are doing around overcoming racism and understanding our own biases, but maybe we'll do that at another point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Well, actually,
I don't
no,
want to
because-
talk too much.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll come back to you. Because
Okay.
And Ghislaine, I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about the schools as systems and within the larger systems, and I wanted to hear a little bit more about that in this context of parent. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when Amy and I were talking a little bit yesterday, I struggle with this notion of like not thinking about schools as systems that exist within a larger ecosystem. And those examples of parent and family engagement are inspiring, right? Because oftentimes, I think we don't think of families and parents as having the funds of knowledge that are important for educators to understand and to leverage, especially in the context of mixed schools or integrated schools or diverse schools. And as I was listening, I'm like, I want to learn more, because in my experience, both in Hartford and in other places, all the events were fine, but they were Band-Aid solutions. And when I worked in Hartford, we felt like the tensions that we were facing were because parents who were not able to secure seats in the best schools in the state of Connecticut or in the greater Hartford region, because of the mandate that the secretary was describing earlier, right, that called for integration, felt left behind. So parents of, and those were parents of color, right? Like as a parent of color, when you feel like you have to enter a lottery to send your child to a school, and you have a mother who comes to your office and say, I have 4 children, 2 of them were able to get into a great school, 2 of them were not. Now I want you to swap their places, because I want my black son to go to the magnet school because it give him a better chance. My daughter, she might be able to survive. So when you have parents who have to make those tough decisions on a daily basis and live in a community where they see that they're left behind and they're the have-nots, it's really hard to come to all the events, right? And I have to work to make ends meet. It's super, super hard. So what we had to do as a staff at the system level, the larger ecosystem level, is think about how to start family-friendly schools, is what we call them. But the goal there really was to create space to talk about the institutional racism that permeates everything that we do in public education, including in the state of Connecticut, that everyone talks about as a model for school integration. And one thing we learned, and a lesson that I take from those days on, is that we use the word diversity oftentimes as code for not addressing the racism and the anti-racist work that we have to do as people and as educators and as communities. So we decided very early on to create spaces for everyone to come together. So we had parents come to the table, educators come to the table, students come to the table, and we were going to like engage in storytelling, right? With some facilitation and with some tools, everyone was going to learn other people's stories, and we were going to stay in uncomfortable work. And then we were going to unpack as a collective within schools and as a system the effect, the impact, and the manifestation of institutional racism and why things are the way they are. And we gave our people tools, and we used the stories that they told to help us make decisions at the system level. And we began to use the language around anti-racist work, language around like, what do we really mean by equity and why is it so hard to achieve it? And when we talk about integration and diversity, while on the surface, it sounds really great, and we all want it, right? Because like, who doesn't want diverse schools? Why is it so hard to achieve, right? Why aren't we addressing the things that are so hard to dismantle? And only then were we able to gain the trust of our communities that were the most impacted, because the events that we were making happen on the surface were not getting us there. But when they felt like, okay, we're having real, honest, critical conversations about our current reality, is when they actually came to the table. And when we're able to get our white communities and white parents to move a little bit away from their self-interest, to understand that there's a higher moral purpose for wanting diverse and integrated schools that actually work well for all children. And that's the only way we're able to bring different facets of our communities together.
Can you talk a little bit more about how your community, how you gain the trust?
Sure.
Yeah.
I would really second what's been said here. And this is not, I don't want to set up a false choice. Like, I actually believe the events are important. We have found that they are absolutely necessary and wholly insufficient. Proximity alone or relationship alone does not undo systemic structures that have been part of our country since its founding. So talking about that is what we've decided to do. Now, we started with our staff and have just recently moved to our families, and we're losing some families over it, I'll be honest. It's not something we know exactly what we're doing. We're trying to be responsible about it, and I do think the tools point and the facilitation point is important. But that's a price that we're willing to pay, because with the cost of what we see in adult behavior now, what we cannot yet figure out, the Achilles heel, in my opinion, of America and its potential. I think it's a place we have to put a stake in the ground for schools like ours, because we're not realizing the potential if we don't take it head on.
And Patricia, I did want to circle back to you. I know that there was a workshop this week that your school held, and I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
So we started, I don't know, there we go. We started about 2 years ago with our faculty, 3 years ago with our faculty, looking at our curriculum and trying to improve ourselves and being more relevant with all of our student needs and the representation that we have in our school. And so we hired some outside consultants to come in and work with our faculty around pedagogy. We then realized, hey, that's just the tip of the iceberg here. We really need to look at internalizing what this really means for us, and how do we look at our own differences, how do we look at differences among our students and our families, and how do we look at our own institution and its imperfection, and trying to keep the mission in front of us, but realizing that we all come with biases, whether we want to admit it or not, right? And so then the following year, we started looking carefully at how our own biases, our own racism gets in the way of doing the work that we could do better. And then, so this past year, our families, our parent group decided, you know what, this is also incredibly important for us to do, because as hard as it is to look at ourselves in the mirror and realize, you know, I didn't realize I felt that way, or maybe it's been a long time since I've faced my own reality about how I feel about a certain situation or a certain sector of people. New Orleans has been changing greatly since Katrina, and we've never had a high population of Hispanic families, and now we do, and it's a wonderful, beautiful addition to the gumbo pot there, right? But everyone is realizing that this is not easy work. That's just the bottom line. It's not easy work, but it is the most important work that we can engage ourselves in. And when we had our very first parent meeting the other night, it was centered around raising a race-conscious child. And we had parents who came to that meeting who haven't been to anything in the school. So it was pretty remarkable.
Wow.
And it's just beginning, right?
And I think it says a lot about the moment that we are in. And I wanted to hear a little bit more, Christy, I think from you, about teaching and leadership and how to ensure that your staff reflects the diversity of the students.
Sure. To take you on a little bit of a journey here, so our schools were founded by a majority, the team was majority people of color. And to this day, our chief level team at the national organization is 100% people of color. And I don't put that out as a mandate, but I do want to flag it because the perspectives coming into the design and planning for our school were far more diverse than I think was typical. And so things like goals for the staff being as diverse as the student population, and the student population being as diverse as the greater Los Angeles area in totality, we're just there from the beginning. And while we've met those goals and we have half of our teachers representing marginalized backgrounds and self-reporting as leaders of color, if we then take things to the next level and look at the hierarchy of our positions, we don't see the equity actually spanning all the way up into the top levels of the organization, which in some ways is a reflection of opportunities outside of our school, but ours to take on. So we're now tripling down on our leadership pipelines to ensure we can take on that problem. But I found that, as with everything with students, the same is true for adults. If we're not purposeful at every single decision point about equitable decisions based on what's true as the default in our country, then we won't actually realize the potential of the diversity at the adult or the student level.
Would anyone else like to share some of their best practices on this and ensuring diverse staff?
I'd like to, if I could, think about or extend some of the answer that Secretary King had on every level of creating new opportunities for teachers of color to want to be teachers. It's very hard actually to look at any young person and say, oh, go be a teacher. It's go to Arizona, be a teacher there. Go to West Virginia, be a teacher there. Go to Baltimore, be a teacher there. As much as I say, please be a teacher. You are a creative, capable, wonderful person. I want you in classrooms working with kids. There are two parts of that. One is at the pieces at every level of disenfranchisement, really, is what we're talking about when we look at punitive systems that are disproportionately affecting people of color, boys of color in particular, girls of color. But we're also looking at not having models in your life of people who look like you in schools at every level. That's not okay. So we have to do better. And I just want to share, again, maybe I don't want to solve Pollyanna-ish, but I do know that in my small realm of influence that there are successes, and I want to share some of them. I think it's really important to know that a small group of people can slowly make concentric circles of difference. So one of the things I think makes a difference is out-of-school opportunity time, right? So we have a lot of opportunities. We can build the opportunities. We can work against tracking. But sometimes if if we close the school at 3:15, and the inequities will just continue, right? Because some people will go home and have lots of programming. Yeah, they'll have lacrosse and they'll have whatever it is that they do until 7 o'clock at night and maybe more than that. But then there will be other people who have fewer out-of-school opportunities to think about who they are and who they might want to be. One of the things that we did to address it was to create a summer camp. To say, you know, we have kids coming to school, and when they come back after the summer, the inequities are more pronounced. We know that summertime makes a difference. So we started a summer camp for rising first through fourth graders that was very much involved in this conversation of who could use a really classical summer camp. Our summer camp is famous now because kids bike. They learn how to ride their bikes at our summer camp. We have this wonderful campus with a track around it, and kids learn how to ride their bikes, and then they go to first grade and second grade, and they learn how to read better because they learned how to ride a bike. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with all kinds of persistence and knowing, but also using that metaphor. That was hard. You didn't know how to do that. Now you do. And one of the other parts of that camp is that we have teenagers come and are counselors at that camp. So they're taught by our staff, but we have counselors. So our students who may leave us in 8th grade or go to high school at City Neighbors High School or beyond come back and see themselves as teachers. And we have students come back to do that work, often children of color, and are paid by the city of Baltimore. So it's about leveraging a number of different institutions, a number of different well-meaning and well-designed examples that can come together. So who sees who doing what, and who actually gets to do what, and who gets to get paid to do what. I think that's one of the small examples. And similarly, we have students who have creative energies that they start something at our school, and when supported, often continue to do that beyond school, and then come back with it much more fully developed. They've come back with, inquiries into the world, into diversity, and brought that to us. We have students who are photographing the refugees of our community, coming back and saying, this is what it's like to be a photographer in Baltimore right now, and share that with our 8th grade students, who then go on and write stories and investigate what is it like to be an immigrant or a refugee in Baltimore right now. We have students who work at the Algebra Project, run that through high school, come back and say, okay, let's change this. Every student at City Neighbors going all the way through algebra, and we're going to make it happen because we're going to partner with you. So seeking partners, working to represent, and starting as young as it comes to bike riding, to understand that your capacity is enormous.
And Ghislaine, yeah, please.
Yeah, PDK, the nonprofit I work for, our small contribution to addressing this challenge was through starting Educators Rising, which is a program that focuses on middle and high school students who are just curious, right, about education and teaching. And the idea here is if we invest in the earliest part of the continuum by looking at our middle and high school young people and create opportunities for them to see what teaching is about, and give them like rigorous content, right, knowledge, and turning that content into a viable CTE or a viable course that will give them early college credit, and then create a pipeline into teacher preparation programs, and then partner with states and communities to help them grow their own by starting chapters in various localities. That might be a way, one, to help young people see, hey, you know what? This teaching thing might be something I can do. And it might be another way to just kind of help people remember how important, hard, and noble education and the teaching profession is. So to date, we have about 50,000 Educators Rising members around the country, and over 50% of them are students of color and students in our rural communities. And our next level of work now is figuring out, okay, they're excited while they're in high school. What's the work that we have to now do to make sure that they stay excited and have the right levels of supports around them, and indeed go into teacher education and go into the profession and are supported while they're in the profession so they can stay and can get mentored so that they eventually take out positions, because so anyway, that's our small contribution.
Yeah, sounds like they should maybe start bike workshops and then keep the pipeline going. Okay, I'm going to open it up. We still have a lot more to talk about, but I would like to open it up to questions from the audience if anyone has any. Yes. Oh, here, the microphone's coming.
Thank you. So my name is Alex Brown. I am currently working to launch a public Montessori charter school in Southeast DC. Will be the first in Southeast DC. Part of that work was inspired by the work of Kate. I spent some time at her school, which is awesome, and I realized that we had gotten to a point where we were post-civil rights, we were post-slavery, and we still weren't teaching African-American students to operate within the context of freedom. I say that for several reasons. I have spent the majority of my time in education working for schools that were very diverse, and they were getting diversity. The diversity work was done very well. The equity work was done terribly wrong. And part of that equity work that was done terribly wrong was because the white dominant culture and those expectations from the outside were still informing the work, whether the leadership was people of color, whether the children were people of color, the expectations were the same. I wonder about the tools that you spoke to and any other tools that people are using to really create those conversations and inform the work of the school that can push past the expectations that are coming from the outside.
That is such a big question, and it's exciting. I would love to spend some time together. Like, there's so many, right? There are organizations that focus on anti-racist work. And some of the tools that we use when I was in Connecticut and that I continue to use in my work are tools from the Pacific Education Group. So simply just thinking about creating spaces for people to engage in courageous conversations. There are several tools in that toolkit, and I won't go into them. Another tool that we use was to kind of help people unpack what happens in their current life while also taking a historical perspective by thinking about critical race theory as a lens. And critical race theory, like that frame, does several things, right? Like, one is to think about how to acknowledge the centrality of race and racism in American life, and public education is part of American life. So if people can acknowledge that everything we do, every single day, racism is present in subtle ways and in very overt ways. And we see that today, right? Including when you have leaders of color. Like, if the policies and the structures are still like centrally like dominated by white ideology, you can't really change things at the root. So the second principle of that lens or critical race theory is to challenge the dominant ideology, right? Like challenging whiteness. And then there's one that I find people struggle with a lot, which is this notion of interest convergence. And basically, it's just like getting real about the fact that diversity, mixing up students and young people, great, right? They all look so beautiful. Like we have a rainbow of skin colors in here. But like, what are we really doing with that diversity, right? Like all other things equal, diversity doesn't get at it. So how do we acknowledge and like help get white allies to help white people do the work that they also have to do by acknowledging that like whiteness as property is something that we have to address, and that even when we consider ourselves liberal, we're still complicit to what's happening. So it was like using specific frames to kind of like structure the conversations and structure the work in a way that would like allow multiple entry points. I think it was Patricia who was talking about the importance of entry points into the conversation, and for people to not remain in a defensive stance or in a crippling state of guilt, but like expand our perspectives individually and collectively and like figure out how to engage in some action that leads to like a different reality. It's hard and it's time consuming, but it's non-negotiable. There are lots of other tools that we can talk about, but I'm sure there are more concrete examples up here.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
I would just say that even using the language that you just shared as part of the conversation, like that is really hard. And what we found is that we're up against people's notion of self, their identity. Because we have people who chose these schools because I genuinely believe they value diversity. Valuing it and actually understanding and being able to navigate difference in an equitable way are two completely separate things. I think what's interesting about it is the further we go, specifically with our teachers, the more incentive there is to drive other outcomes we care about. Like all of a sudden, teacher retention and student retention, it's like when you go through this journey with people, you really want people to stay so you can get on the other side of it. I wish we were far enough along to tell you that I would give a thumbs up across organization. I think we have pockets of real exciting progress, and I do not think we figured it out yet.
I want to just share and maybe remind people that one of the major tools is teacher autonomy and teacher expertise, and teachers in the room together voicing their own truths and talking together about the collective work that we do, and having the opportunity to design curriculum that they know is responding to children. One example, we have a third grade teacher who student came to her with a book that he wanted to check out of the library called Everything Pink, and had been teased about it. And that question sponsored a curriculum study into bookstores. What's in a bookstore? How does a bookstore get arranged? What are diverse books? What is this website called? We need diverse books. What is this book that I'm writing? Then how can I make it diverse? What are the different kinds of diversity that we need to have? And that in order to unpack some things, you start with kids' questions. And if you are a responsive teacher and you have colleagues of all kinds helping you think through hard ideas, it feels like the adventure. It doesn't feel maybe as burdensome as, okay, now we're going to, okay, stop, courageous, conversation coming, ready? You know, like, okay, we're going to talk about white privilege, who'll be there? Raise your hand, you know, like, it's when I come and say, hey, Jason came to me with this question. I don't know exactly where to go with it. Does anybody want to be a thought partner with me? And at the table are a diverse group of teachers. You wind up having curriculum that's very exciting, and it makes you want to be a teacher and makes kids want to be learning. So, teacher autonomy.
Next question.
Oh, we answered them all.
Any other questions? I can ask another question then. I will ask another question. We didn't really get into discipline,
Okay.
and that's what the next talk will be about. But I'm just curious to hear what steps that your school has taken to eliminate or minimize racial and socioeconomic disparities in school discipline, another big topic. So, Patricia, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to share our challenges with that, and our we have a few celebrations even. I think where one of our biggest challenges around discipline, well, there's two of them. One is that teachers often, unfortunately, are looking for consequences for student behavior. And I've come to the point in my career where I feel like it's not the look at the consequence, it's understanding the behavior. That's the key to creating whatever discipline protocol you're going to have in your school or even in your classroom. If we don't understand the source of the behavior, where this could be coming from, why is this child acting out, we are not going to get to the root of being able to really help this child learn. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's the aspect that we feel on a daily basis as administrators, I'm sure, other people in this room I'm sure can echo this. When you have some of our parents feeling like, oh gosh, you're too hard on these kids, and other parents feeling like, oh my goodness, why aren't you hard enough? And so that tension that exists, and it often breaks out along racial lines, right? And so that is the conversation that we are really working towards having with parents collectively, to really talk more about the ways that kids are disciplined at home and how that plays out in complete chaos and misunderstanding at school, right? So we've been looking very carefully at what it means to have a school suspension policy. Are we about to consider getting rid of that? I don't know, but we certainly are having the conversation because we know the research is out there that tells us that it does not work to send a student home. We know that. We also know that it doesn't help to have an in-school suspension program if it's completely punitive and there's no support for the child within whatever system you've created. So I can say, Amy, that we are struggling with this. That's where we currently are. And knowing that we all in life have consequences, that, you know, that there's nothing wrong with consequences, but are we matching the consequences to the behavior? And is there a connection for the kid at the end of the day?
One practice I've seen work well is to start with data, right? Because when I used to go straight for why is this kid suspended, and it didn't work well with teachers. But looking at data and helping people unpack data and seeing trends, right? Like when it comes to discipline, who is getting disciplined for what reason? There are generally patterns that you see. Students who are in special education, students of color are some of the students who end up disciplined in harsh ways, right? For minor infractions too. So starting with data and then getting people to ask why. Like why, until we get to the root causes where people can come to their own like self-awareness about how beliefs influence decision making. And then as a leader or as leaders, like being vulnerable and talking about our own implicit biases too and our own beliefs that may lead to some of the same behaviors and practices, I think is helpful. Another practice is restorative practices. So once people understand data and the patterns of how we like criminalize children in like systems and schools, restorative practices becomes a professional development like opportunity that can help change the ways in which we discipline children and how we match behavior to consequences, but also how we create like opportunities for schools to become communities where young people have the opportunity to correct their behaviors because they're growing and they're developing. So just those two examples.
Would you like to share too?
We have a 0% suspension and expulsion rate across our schools, and I think because the data is now being publicly shared more readily, I think that may make it sound like we're more aware of some of the bias than we are. I actually think it was our pedagogical model that drove that percentage, or the lack of a percentage. We've always had a very heavy focus on social and emotional learning, and so through that strand, we have 3 strands within our schools: core academics, social and emotional development, and difference and inclusion. And the truth is, if you hold up core academics, it's just far more robust than anything that's in social and emotional development or difference and inclusion. So we're working on the standards and assessments and curricular maps that would blow out those two strands so that they're held equal to core academics, because we actually find what's going on in these suspension issues is not about the academics, it's about other strands that are not as readily measured or thought about or explicitly talked about. I do think it's an interesting door to equity, because equity issues pop up all over the place when you start talking about discipline, but it's also just an ineffective practice for the student being suspended. So I think that is where our teachers probably got to first.
There's a question there.
Oh, question, yes.
Related to the topic that just came up, I've been sort of wondering what it might look like. In California, there's been a lot of conversation about the problems with our statewide dashboards, and in LA with our local dashboards. And I'm curious, like, if you were to put together sort of a DEI index for your schools, like, what measures would you include, obviously, beyond just demographic diversity? What would you specifically want in a measure like that that would be on a dashboard, for example, available to parents?
Yeah.
So equity metrics is a fascinating thing, and I'm glad that Ghislaine has brought up all of these ideas of having data to look at. And you're bringing up that we don't have sufficient data to really talk about it. And even that small piece of data that the Secretary talked about, that if you have one African-American teacher in grades 3, 4, and 5, 10 years later you have an outcome, right? So somebody measured that, right? What else can we measure that can tell the story of successful decision making at one point that leads to an outcome of a fairer and more just society. I think, again, it's been coming up, the idea of storytelling and qualitative. If you look at Smarter Charter, another plug for the book, if you look at other kinds of stories, we have to share across networks that allow us to see exemplary practice. And I think we will probably notice trends about exemplary practice that collapses dominant and seeks non-dominant kinds of ideology, but also will collapse the hierarchies that exist in almost any school. So when we look at Dick Deasy's work in about studio thinking or a third space, that actually in this place that I call school, these people know me, right? And I'm okay being myself here. I don't know how many American children can say that. Or certainly, we have always hoped that they can find just that one person in those 13 years who really cared about them. That's pathetic. So we really need to make sure that they can say that every year about many people, and they can go to and seek out. So it's a much bigger question. I can't give you a DEI index set of figures, but I know that we need better metrics for what we do will turn into equity.
And those metrics, thank you for sharing that, Kate. I think we have to decolonize metrics and methodologies a little bit. And when you think about social emotional learning and the research and work around grit and resilience and persistence, right? Like, I think that research opened the door for amazing and critical conversations. But when you look at researchers and scholars and practitioners of color, and you sit and you talk and you spend time with families of color, or just like where, places where cultural practices and beliefs and norms are different, I think there is something to be learned there. So I will encourage you to look at someone in particular. Her name is Dr. Bettina Love, and her research is on hip hop education and hip hop theory, and she analyzes and provides a counter to the current research, which is dominated by white ideology, on how we should measure the experiences and achievements of students of color, especially students who come from the African diaspora worldwide. And I was exposed to it a few years ago, and it opened my thinking to how we should rethink measurements connected to things like equity. So that could be a starting place.
And Valerie, I know we get a chance to talk about this in LA already, but I worry about starting with the measures when the standards aren't clear, right? So I'm not sure what we're measuring, to be frank, and I think then we're at risk for all of the default mechanisms to apply. So we're choosing to go the other direction. It is messy, messy work, but at least it allows us the conversation about what it is we value, which is starting to uncover all kinds of interesting topics for our staff.
Okay, so thank you. I hope that you take some of these lessons back to your own practices, and I'm sure these women will be around later if you have more questions. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.